Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed. Hi, welcome to Writers in Focus. I'm your host, James Taylor, and today I'm delighted to have as my guests Judith, Alexander, Augustine,
Right.
and Doug Alexander. Judith, welcome to the Atlanta Fulton
James.
Public Library and the Fulton County Government Center. This is going to be a great show because we're here to celebrate the life and times of your father, Cecil Alexander. Just before your father passed away last month, July 2013, he wrote this remarkable book called Crossing the Line, The Awakening of a Good Old Boy in the War Years 1941 to 1945. I'm going to read the first paragraph of the New Georgia Encyclopedia. This was just entered a couple of weeks ago. Your father, Cecil Alexander, was a prominent Atlanta architect and civic leader. As a partner in the architectural firm FabRap, he was responsible for some of the city's most notable public buildings. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s, he was a leader in the movement to peacefully desegregate the city's housing, public housing, and local businesses. He also designed a new state flag that removed one of the last symbols of Georgia's racially divided past. Having read this book, I feel that this is what I think, Judith and Doug, that you come from this most remarkable father. Your father's done these incredible things. He lived to be 95 years old. I'm going to give you a chance to talk in a minute. And you probably begged him in the last 10 years of his life, Dad, write it down, write it down. Any truth in that?
I don't think he took a lot of convincing to write it down, actually.
I think what the convincing was finish it.
Finishing it was the hard part.
I think it took him 8 years, 7 or 8 years to
He
really
wrote it over
finish
6 years, I
6
think.
years,
And then it kind of languished.
Okay.
And I'm not sure exactly what happened, but when I moved in to help take care of him and his wife, Helen, my husband and I moved in to help oversee the household and everything. And I realized that the book wasn't going to get published unless I took it on and did something with it, and I'm no book publisher. But I managed to do it with the help of several wonderful friends, people who didn't even know him. I just put the word out on Facebook, and lots of people stood up, and I'd send them a chapter and send them a chapter and send them a chapter. And so we cleaned it up a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doug, I'm going to give you some framework for this. Your father was born in 1918. He was the son of prosperous Jewish merchants of Virginia Highlands. Mm-hmm. Your father lived in a house that had an upstairs servant, a downstairs servant, a chauffeur, a cook, a guy that used to take him on a motorcycle, a black man on his Harley Davidson. Your father grew up in the most incredible privilege, and yet at the same time he was known as an architect who helped desegregate Atlanta and became personal friends of John Lewis, among other people. Does that ever... I'm in awe of that. Did that occur to you as a child, that your father was this... He was the history of Atlanta for 20th century?
Well, as I was growing up, this all was just normal to me.
Oh, Leonard Cohen comes by the house, and Yeti Mahonen dropped by to play a little violin.
Exactly. I did not know that I was privileged in any way, shape, or form. I thought everybody had this sort of thing. And I think that actually helped that it didn't spoil me in that respect, that I felt like I was superior to anybody because we had these connections and knew all these people and had this cool round house. It just seemed, sort of like our kids today take the built environment, these highways, as if they've been here for millions of years. And so that's sort of how it felt for me. And it was particularly interesting growing up in the 60s. In a very turbulent time, but not, in our house, the turbulence was between parents and children, and not the outside world primarily. And it just never occurred to me that that anyone should treat anybody any different from anyone else, for any reason, really.
Judith, how about you? Did you feel the same way?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the atmosphere that we lived in. Our parents, we had a remarkable mother, I have to say, you know, and they...
May I call her Hermie?
Hermie,
yeah.
Yes. They had, they entertained, and there was also always multiracial, you know, that was just... That was
the way it was.
It was the way
Yeah.
it was, but I'm a little older than my young baby brother here.
Oh, you don't look it.
Thank
No,
you.
no.
And so I think that I had a little more awareness of it. And when I was in the 8th grade at Lovett School was the year that they tried to integrate, Martin Luther King applied for his...
The third, right?
Well, it was
Marty,
Martin Luther...
It was his children,
Gotcha.
Marty
Gotcha.
and...
Yeah, they tried to get their children in. Martin Luther King and Coretta King tried to get their children into Lovett. My father was on the board. He resigned. I was, 13 years old, and pulled me out of there, which I didn't appreciate at all because those were my friends. I'd been with them since nursery school. But, you know, it made me, it was sort of my awakening at that point was, there are some stands to take here, and you have to do whatever you have to do.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because I know you're both modest people, and you grew up with this remarkable man, and it probably occurred to you that everybody decides to go to Georgia Tech, drop out of Georgia Tech. I think I'll go to Yale. I'm going to graduate from Yale University in 4 years, then go to MIT, work on wait a second, there's World War II's breaking out. I'm going to become a Marine dive bomber pilot for 4 years. Have 60 dive bombing missions, have over 100 surveillance missions, go back to graduate school and have Walter Gropius, the father of the Bauhaus movement, oversee my dissertation, and become friends with Marcel Breuer, who designed the library that I work in. I'm going, what?
Well, doesn't everybody do that?
Doesn't everybody do that? But your father, the book is in 2 parts. The first part is Crossing the Line, The Awakening of a Good Old Boy. And I'm going to not put you on the spot, but he talks about the awakening of the good old boy. It happened to him in 4 basic stages. Number 1, he was growing up. The United States was changing during World War II. He worked side by side with African American soldiers who he maintains saw even more combat than he did. When he was at Harvard University after the war, he became best friends with Conrad Jackson. Johnson,
right.
A black man who was a Tuskegee airman.
Right.
He was also married to Hermie, the third step, who taught him more about human relations coming from New Orleans and that background of segregation than anybody. And also he was just living in Atlanta, an epicenter of the civil rights movement. I have a question here somewhere, but what were you kids doing when your father was doing all of this stuff?
We were going to school and growing up.
Okay.
But you know,
we're here to talk about the book, but I'm astonished.
Sure. Well, where his activity came through was, for us, at least for me, was all these. It seemed weekly that we would have cocktail parties of close to 100 people, and it was people of all persuasions, and that was, you know, that was walking the walk.
Yeah.
Because Dad also talked the talk. He was very much out in front, with a lot of help from Mayor Hartsfield and Mayor Allen, to be out in front and say, this is the right thing to do, and we need to do it. And sometimes he ticked people off that way. And I remember Judy and I were talking about this coming over, about he would get threats. And he didn't think much of them until a sitting judge called him. Most of the threats were anonymous, and people just call it, you're dead, Alexander, that sort of thing. Well, this judge called up, identified himself, and then said, you're dead. So Dad went out and bought a revolver, which fortunately he never needed to use.
It's in the book, and pardon my language, but it freaked him out. I mean, having killed many Japanese in World War II, he's saying to myself, I know what killing is. I don't want to do this ever again. And your father goes, I've got a gun in my hand? I'm sleeping with a gun? That was a very moving part of the book. There are so many illustrative anecdotes in this book. Judith, talk about, it's 1964, 65. Martin Luther King Jr. has just won the Nobel Prize, and just about every historian I know has covered this, but your father has something I didn't know. He was very responsible for getting Atlanta's civic leaders together to honor Martin Luther King, who had just won the Nobel Prize. But what the public doesn't realize now, in 2013, is that the big mules, as your father would have them characterized, didn't want to do it. Could you tell that story?
Well, as best I can.
This is history.
It is, and I don't have a firm grasp
on
it.
Good.
But because I was a kid, and I was much more interested in
1964,
other
you were
things.
like 3 years old, right?
About that.
Right.
Yeah.
She was actually younger than me.
It was the way I understand it is
yeah.
that it was Paul Austin, who was the president of Coca-Cola,
CEO. Woodruff was running Coca-Cola, and
Right.
I defer to Doug, a former city councilman. I defer to you on Atlanta history.
I mean, my understanding, I think it was Coke. The
yeah.
people at Coke
Oh, yeah.
who said, Atlanta needs Coke. Coke doesn't need Atlanta. We can go elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, Dad helped convey that message. Made it known to the people at Coke. This is what we're dealing with. Basically, what's your message? And got that out to them. And I think that he played a huge part in getting those people to that dinner, with the understanding that if they didn't, then Atlanta as a business community was just going to tank.
Yeah.
And that was their motivation.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that had to be the motivation, but it takes something.
Well, Dad said to me, that the issue that he tried to convey is that it's not black and it's not white, it's green. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to end up like Birmingham or Alabama. We want to make sure Atlanta is on the forefront, that Atlanta is the vanguard of just thinking, of good, honest communications between people, and to say, you've been treated poorly, and we're going to stop it. And and one of the things about it that one of the things Dad was best at as an architect, frankly, was getting business. That was his real forte, was putting teams together and going and winning the job. But he put so much of that in jeopardy when he would take these stances, and because he knew, it was the right thing to do, and he also had the support from our mother, who said, you must do the right thing, regardless of the outcome. You must do the right thing. And I think hopefully that's rubbed off on the two of us, and we try to rub it off on our kids and people
And
we
our
know.
sister.
Yeah.
And our sister.
Yeah,
Three
who
of us,
couldn't be
yes.
here.
I don't want to forget Terry, of course.
See, having read the book, it's an astonishing account of Atlanta history in this great man, and he's your father. Your father did have this great moral awakening, though, that people like Yankees such as I do, how can you live in a segregated city? In the beginning of the book, your father talks about being in Atlanta in the 1950s. He's a successful businessman, an architect, and the legendary Mayor Hartsfield calls him up and said, Cecil, I want you to head up this commission on urban redevelopment, get rid of the slums. So your father travels into these African-American communities, and your father, and I'm quoting from memory, I will. He says, these aren't slums. Slums are nice places to live for poor people. This is a shanty town with no electricity, no running water, and your father was shocked.
He was.
Yeah, and it astonishes me that your father did that. Fourth time I've used that. It's an astonishing book, all right?
I think the tipping point, and you alluded to it earlier,
Sure.
being in the war, fighting side by side with African Americans, realizing he was coming home to a very different country than they were, and the absolute inequity of that, where did that come from? I don't know. Where that ability to see, because plenty of people saw it and they didn't do anything about it. I can't answer. I don't. Why he did. I mean, I think part of it was our mother. Definitely, she was an amazing force, and I don't know what else.
Sure,
I don't know.
I want people to go out and buy this book.
Maybe they can figure it out.
It's also, I think, although Dad wasn't what you would call a very devout Jew, but he certainly, I think, internalized the mitzvah of healing the world, and having helped to rid the world of the pestilence of Nazism and of totalitarianism, although obviously we haven't rid the world of it, but at least set it back a ways. Saw that there's work to be done at home after coming back, and that I like to think that there are greater generations ahead, but so far that's certainly the best one we've had, and so much good has come from the men and women who were involved in World War II that without the war he might not have stood up and said that's enough.
Can we talk about, and I told you before the interview, I'm kind of a fan of military history, like the little boy that I continue to be as I get older. But your father was stationed on the Marshall Islands in World War II. Mm-hmm. And not only did he see combat, and I love this, the chapter where he describes himself as the prototypical smart bomb. He was in a Douglas Dauntless SPD, a slow but deadly dive bomber, where you would cruise up to 12,000 feet, lock on a target with your sight, and dive on it and release your bomb at the last possible moment. Did he ever talk about that? Because my father never, Dad, tell me what you did in World War II. He killed people. He doesn't want to talk about it.
I don't know about you, but you being the boy, you may have gotten more than I did, but I never heard any of that, and I was riveted when I read that. I mean, just because he goes into such detail about what it was like, what it felt like, and what he had to do, and all of that, I thought that was pretty amazing.
How about you, Doug? I mean,
I learned
that exists on its own as a piece of military history.
Well, I love that book. In the book, and I love it particularly because I learned so much. I knew some of the stories, but there was so much of it I didn't know, and I didn't know about the thing about seeing these Japanese men as the bomb was coming down on them. He'd never talked to me about that.
That was a hard one for him to bring up, I think.
Do you want to talk about it?
Well, I mean, I think really. One of the things about being in aviation is you often never see your enemy, and with these standoff weapons, it's even more so. But in those days, when you were the bomb, you had to get in close, and the chances of you seeing your enemy, your opponent, right there in front of you, were greater than they are today. But it wasn't anything like being a Marine on the ground and having to actually shoot directly at people. The way the troops had to do.
But just so the audience knows what we're talking about, your father is on basically a surveillance mission over a Japanese-held island in the Marshall Islands, and he sees a launch filled with Japanese soldiers. His twin 50 caliber machine guns jam, but he has 2 depth charges on board.
They actually were normal bombs. They weren't depth charges, I don't believe. But 2 500-pound bombs, one each on each side of the wing, and
he turns around and says, "I think I'll go back and get them."
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's war.
Yeah.
And as that wonderful line from Patton, it's not,
right.
It's the goal is to kill the enemy, and that was his job, and he did it to the best of his ability, but he also brought that home with him and that understanding. And that was also part of why when, as a war prize, the city of Atlanta got this religious icon, that bell.
From
Nakushka, was it?
I can't remember.
I've forgotten where it was.
It's in there.
And Ivan Allen, I believe it was, asked Dad, we need a pavilion for this thing. And Dad said, no, we don't. We need to take it back. It needs to go back to the people it belongs to. And I think a lot of the sensibility he got, particularly from that one moment, had a lot to do with that, and it went back. And in fact, I know Mom and Dad saw it back there in Japan some years later. It was one of his favorite trips because everybody was mistaking him for
Marlon
Brando. Because it just, an American, I don't think it had anything to do with any real resemblance. It was just, Marlon Brando, sure, why not? I don't know if he signed any autographs.
I don't think he did.
But your father even went back with your mother to revisit the Marshall Islands. Incredible.
Yeah, there's a story in there about him sitting down with a Japanese man who fought in the war, and they were both back in Majuro.
Yeah.
And they had to have an interpreter, but they were both there for the same reason, to go back and bring things full circle, and for them to sit down together. I think that must have been one of the most poignant moments of his life.
Also in the book is that your father is not just, and I've read many memoirs and autobiographies of great men. I think your father was a great man. That he's not reluctant to expose his not weakness is the wrong word, but when he comes back from the South Pacific and he's going to meet your mother in San Francisco, he was a damaged man, and he admits it. He said, I had trouble showing my feelings to this wife, this woman, this beautiful woman that I love. A very, very moving section. Do you want to talk about that or?
What I remember,
it's hard, isn't it? But it's in the book. It's in the book.
Yeah.
And what I remember of that story is
post-trauma, sick, just whatever. Yeah.
I think anybody who's in war is affected, has, what do they call it?
A post-traumatic stress.
Post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
But of course, it wasn't identified then, and he didn't know to expect it, and I think he felt there was something wrong with him. And my mother, of course, didn't know to expect it, and the story goes that he overheard her saying to her parents, Alex is back, that's what she called him, and he hasn't changed a bit. And and hearing her say that just made him realize how very much he had changed and how they needed to do a lot of getting to know each other again.
I've got to ask the both of you this. I'll start off with Doug, but when you were kids driving around Atlanta, did your schoolmates ever say, did your daddy really design the Coca-Cola building? Did your daddy really design the Braves Stadium? Did you know that? I mean,
yeah, and the stadium, of course, was the bigger deal to everybody.
They tore it down, but
that
was
broke
a sad
heart.
day in our family.
Yeah.
But it was not something. I didn't brag about my dad's accomplishments that much. In fact, I bragged so much more about our mom becoming the first woman jury commissioner in Georgia, and I think I was in second grade, and I thought I could have her send people to jail if they were mean to me. Which I never tested that, but I loved driving around with Dad. Because of that, I developed at first a tolerance and later an appreciation for classical music, because that's all he ever played, unless the Braves were on. And now the best way to listen to the Braves is on the radio, on AM, for me, and it just brings back those feelings driving around with him. And he lived, breathed, and ate baseball. He always loved that game. And to have a hand in bringing the Braves to Atlanta and to building that stadium, it really was one of the great things for him. I got to tell this story. Part of the deal for his firm, FabRap, in designing the stadium, was that the principals got to go down to spring training every year for a week with their wives on behalf of,
Little Dougie went to...
No. This was just the guys and their wives, no children. That would ruin it for them, I think.
Yeah.
Being a father, you could say that.
Absolutely understand. And but they would, this was on the Braves' dime, that they would go there. And some of the guys, and Dad particularly, would get in uniform and go out and shag flies and hit balls and just play ball during spring training. And Dad always felt a little, like a little fish out of water, being much older than any of the guys playing and also not really being a professional player. But he really took a lot of joy and satisfaction when he's out in center, I think, shagging flies, and this rookie says to the manager, which was later related to Dad, "Who's that hippopotamus out in center field?"
Oh no!
That they're trying out.
Yeah, which Dad took to mean this guy thinks I'm a real player, and that became, he was very proud of that, and so hippopotamuses became sort of what Dad got, some hippopotamus themed, until he said, "Okay, that's enough," and we stopped. But that baseball thing, it's like that line in Field of Dreams. Baseball's eternal, and it was for Dad, and that's really a great connection for the two of us. Judy's a much bigger baseball fan than I am. She knows stats and things.
Really?
And whereas I just like to go watch him play. No, it's not.
Well, listen, ladies and gentlemen, I've had the distinct honor of talking with Judith and Doug Alexander, their father, Cecil Alexander, one of the giants of Atlanta history, of U.S. history in many ways, has written this magnificent book. It's called Crossing the Line, The Awakening of a Good Old Boy and the War Years 1941 to 1945. Go to your public library, get this book. Go to Amazon, buy this book. Go to your local bookstore, get this book. It's a wonderful read. It's also a history of our times. Judith, thank you for being here.
Thank you so
and Doug,
much.
thank you for being here.
And it's going to be available shortly at the Hit.
Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed.